Hi, everybody. It is nice to be back in this Elul time. I really feel this year we're feeling Elul very strongly. I'm not sure why, but here in Israel, the weather at least is more cooperative towards Elul, which is nice. And I don't know, feeling a lot of trying to do tshuva in the air. So, of course, our learning, as always, is for the merit of the release of all the hostages and the refuah shlema of everyone who's sick and the protection of our soldiers. And you all know the rest. Okay, so we're going to do four different classes, and each one is going to connect something about the Yamim Noraim with Eretz Yisrael. So the first one that we're starting with is this time of Elul, and one of the customs of Elul is a very interesting time because there's no real halacha about Elul. There are a lot of minhagim about Elul. There's this idea, ani l'dodi v'dodi li, we want to get closer to Hashem. We want to try to ready ourselves for the Yamim Noraim. Right? If you've been going to shul, you know David Hashem Ori and Shofar. And then there are all sorts of other customs. And one of the customs, which has taken hold in some communities, not in all communities, is that during Elul, or really Erev Rosh Chodesh Elul, is a time to go visit Kever Avos. It's a time to go to visit graves. And so I thought that was a good way for us to talk about graves and burial in Judaism. What we're looking at, of course, is the most famous Jewish cemetery in the world, and that's the cemetery on Har HaZeitim, right? The oldest Jewish cemetery that's still in use. We're going to talk a little about Har HaZeitim, not too much because we've done a class on that, but we will definitely talk about it a little bit. Burial, right? Burial is a very big deal in Judaism. This week's parsha, right? Lo talin nivlato al eitz, right? You should not leave a corpse hanging on a tree. You have to bury it. And the idea of burial, of burying all parts of somebody, right? In Israel, of course, we have Zaka, Zihui Korbanot Ason, where they, and unfortunately, they have been involved. It used to be really traffic accidents, but also some terror attacks. And of course, on October 7th and afterwards, Zaka has been so prominent in dealing with bringing people to burial. And this idea of burial is very much a fundamental idea in Judaism. So what we're going to talk about is, first of all, the idea of visiting graves altogether and praying at graves, right? Is this good? Is this bad? Depends on who you are, I think, partly. And then we're going to see how do we bury over time. And then we're going to look at a few significant graves, famous graves, also a few graves that are, don't tell anybody, not really the people that we say that they are. Okay, so that's just to give us a little bit of an overview. So first of all, the idea of praying at graves. Praying at graves is a phenomenon that we see it a lot today, right? You can come to Israel, or not even Israel, by the way. You can do it in the United States too, and go on a Kfarim tour, right? You can go up north. You can go to visit various graves, some more authentic than others, right? And going and praying, and at each one there are special kavanot and special things. We'll talk a little bit later on about the Ari, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, and his connection to identifying the graves and why we go to the graves. But let's take a step backwards for a second. Why, right? Is this a good idea? Should you be going to pray at graves? And the Gemara talks about, in the Gemara in Ta'anit, when it talks about fasting when things happen, right? When we have a drought or other disasters, one of the suggestions is to go to the cemetery. And the Gemara says, why? Why do they go to the cemetery? And you have a machloket. Rabbi Levi Bar Chama and Rabbi Chanina disagree with regard to this matter. One said, this is as though to say, we are like the dead before you, right? One opinion is we want to go, it's a way to humble ourselves, right? Look at us, have mercy on us. We're only human. One day we are going to be in the cemetery as well. This is what we're saying to Hashem, but we're also saying it to ourselves, right? And to understand that now, Hevel Havalim, it's not going to last forever, and everybody's going to die eventually, and that's going to make you do tshuva, and it's going to make you a more humble person. But the other opinion is one goes to the cemetery in order that the deceased will request mercy on our behalf. And that's where we get to a much more controversial idea, which is that we ask the dead to intercede with us before God, right? We don't pray to the tzaddik, but we ask the tzaddik, who we assume has extra points, to intercede with God for us on our behalf. And there are differences of opinions, right? Some people think this is Doresh el Hametim. This is having necromancy and getting the dead involved in your life. The Rambam says we don't need any intermediaries. We speak directly to Hashem. Others say, no, 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 we need the zchut of the tzaddikim. It's definitely something that breaks down along different lines, right, of Eidot and of different poskim. The Gra of Vilna Gaon said, never go to the cemetery, never go to graves. And there are all different kinds of stories about people who did, who didn't. We won't get into, psak, obviously. I don't know if Rabbi Kalman wants to pipe in at some point and talk about psak. But is definitely something that is very significant to remember. First of all, that you are not praying to the person, right? You don't go to the Ohel of the Rebbe and pray to the Rebbe. You pray that the Rebbe should help you with Hashem, who you are praying to. And even if you make that distinction, there are those who would say, no, 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 this is not something that is necessary in Judaism, but it is definitely something that has become very popular. It always was, but even more so these days. And Kivrei Tzadikim, it's big business. I'll just add one final story. It's a story that's been attributed to a lot of different people. I heard it about Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, right? Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach is Zecher Tzadik Lebracha, one of the greatest of the poskim of the 20th century, who was asked by a yeshiva student. He said, I don't know, should I be mevatel Torah in order to go up to the Galil and pray at the Kivrei Tzadikim? I don't know if I should spend the time to do that. And Rav Shlomo Zalman said to him, you don't need to go up north. All you need to do is take the bus to Har Herzl and pray at the Kvarim there, which is a very interesting thing that we can think about today when we're talking about the army and Haredim, etc. Okay, moving
Shulie.
on, away from politics.
Shulie.
How did Jews bury? Okay, so Jews bury differently at different time periods, even though when we think about burial, we tend to think of it as something very, very conservative, right? Conservative with a small c, that it never changes, but it's not true. It has changed over time. And probably the most significant change, and one that some people suggest should come back into vogue, is the idea of primary and secondary burial, right? This idea that first you lay the body out until the body decomposes, and then you gather the bones. What's the advantage of this? Why do people talk about it today? We talk about it today because today we have so many people in the land of Israel, and we don't have a lot of space, right? And anyone who's been recently to many of the cemeteries in Israel, Har HaMenuchot or other ones, you know that they're already burying in the wall, in shelves, because there's just not enough space. And so there's a suggestion that we should do this, that we should bury only the bones and not the entire body. But this goes back to First Temple times, right? By Rishon times, we have the phrase over and over again in Tanakh, that somebody dies, Ve'ye'esaf el avotav. He is gathered onto his fathers. You can think of this as a very nice philosophical idea, but it's actually a physical, material idea. Person dies, if he's wealthy, right? This is only true for the wealthy people, right? Not wealthy people end up in a field somewhere, but a wealthy family has a burial cave. We're going to talk about this one in a moment. And the burial cave has niches in it, and the body is laid out to decompose. And after it decomposes, the bones were collected and they were put into what's called a ma'asefa, a central place where all the bones go together. Okay? We have various caves like this. Very famous one in a place called Ketef Hinnom, right near the Begin Center in Jerusalem, where we didn't actually find the entire cave, but we did find some of these places where the bodies are laid out, and we found at one of the caves that was not broken into and that has all kinds of stuff inside, including the famous Birkat Kohanim. But this is a fascinating place. This is below a crypt in what's called the Saint Etienne Monastery, okay, a monastery of Dominican priests north of Shar Shechem. on Derech Shem. In the late 19th century, the Dominicans buy a piece of land. They build a church. They build a place for the priest to be, and they make a crypt for the priest to be buried, not knowing that underneath the crypt was actually an ancient burial cave. Okay, and when they started to lay the foundations for the crypt, they uncovered this cave, which is the perfectly preserved, gorgeous, and you can see the little niches, and you can actually go into it and see where the Ma'asefah, where the bones are. It's really wild. Okay, so that's Bayit Rishon. Bayit Sheni times, we still have this two-step process, but we have something different, and that's that the bones are collected, but instead of everybody's bones being put in the same place, right, Vayesaf el avotav, suddenly we want my bones are my bones, your bones are your bones, people's bones are separated, and everybody's bones gets their own little bone box. What's called in Aramaic a gluskema or a deluskema in the Mishnah, and in English it's called an ossuary, and that's these beautiful, very lovely carved, simple boxes that are as big as the longest bone in the body, is the femur. Okay, so you still have this idea of primary and secondary burial, but now we want everybody's bones to be separate. Why does this change? Different answers, right? One answer, one suggestion is it's external influences. We look at the Greeks and the Romans who take the bodies and they burn them and they put the ashes in an individual vessel. We can't do that because we really sanctify the body, but we can have these individual containers, right? The other suggestion is, no, this is not an external influence, it's internal influence, right? Jews in Bayit Sheni times, Judaism becomes much more individual. You have individual prayer instead of only group communal prayer. You have individual study. You have a lot of things that become more individuated. Ossuaries burial is one of them. Okay, we have a few ossuaries. We have a lot of ossuaries that have been found made out of stone with these beautiful decorations. But the most interesting ones are not the beautiful ones, but the ones that have writing. Okay, and you can see a famous one over here. Okay, this is today in the Israel Museum, was found in Israel, in Jerusalem, excuse me. And you can see that it has on it writing. Okay, it has the same writing on the long side and also on the short side. What does it say? Very nice, clear Hebrew letters like we use today. Simon Boneh Hechala. Simon, the builder of the temple. This guy, what did he want to be known for? He didn't want to be known as a learned man or a Baal Tzedakah or a family man or anything else that people put on their gravestones. He wanted to be known as the guy who helped to build the Beit HaMikdash, right? What did he do? We don't know, right? But that was what was significant. And we have various other ossuaries that have writing on them, not so many, but they're usually very exciting when we find them. Okay, so that's Bayit Sheni times. And finally, oh, well, one more thing in Bayit Sheni times, you also had people who had the resources to build themselves fantastic funerary monuments. Okay, so at the very beginning, we had a picture of Har HaZeitim and Yad Avshalom down here. Okay, Yad Avshalom, despite its name, is not from Bayit Rishon. It's not Avshalom ben David, even though we call it that because there's a pasuk that says that Avshalom built a monument because he didn't have children. But in that same valley, the Kidron Valley, we have Yad Avshalom. We have two other enormous funerary monuments, Kever B'nai Chizir, Kever Zechariah. These are all late Second Temple times, right? Late first century, late first century BCE, early first century CE, right? Up until the time of Churban Bayit, of the destruction of the temple. We see ones that look like this in our neighbor in Petra in Jordan. And based on Petra and based on these monuments in Nachal Kidron, we reconstruct Herod's grave, which also, we have pieces of it, we don't have the whole thing, but based on these other ones, this is what we think it looks like. Also, one of these enormous, fantastic monuments that you really could only have if you were very, very, very wealthy. So we have very few of them. Okay? After the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed, and then we have the terrible 65, 70 years later, we have the terrible Bar Kokhba revolt, right? Two terrible revolts in the span of 70 years. Many, many people are murdered. Many people are crucified by the Romans, and burial changes yet again. And this time we lose this idea of two stages, right? We no longer have this. There are places where it still continues, right? If you go to the southern Hebron Hills, if you go to Susia, okay, they carry on these old traditions into the third, the fourth, the fifth century. They're still burying in ossuaries, but in most places, this is finished. And instead, they do a variation of what we do today, right? In Chutz La'aretz anyway, right? Of putting the body in a coffin, right? What's called a sarcophagus. In Eretz Israel today, we don't use coffins. We put the bodies directly in the ground. But in Chutz La'aretz, we do use coffins. And here they used coffins made out of stone. This is pictures from Beit She'arim, this fantastic cave, the Ma'arat HaAronot, the cave of the sarcophagi, which has over 120 of these fantastic, gorgeous, decorated sarcophagi. Why do things change? It's a good question. One suggestion is because there was so much horror and death and destruction in the Bar Kokhba revolt, and so many bodies that couldn't be properly claimed and buried. We just said, unfortunately, like we say today, we're just going to take all the pieces that we have, put them into this box, and bury it as it is. Okay, again, in a cave, not necessarily in the ground, okay, but without the two-stage process. One other type of burial, okay, cenotaph. A cenotaph is just a very fancy way of saying a tziyun kever. Right? It's a big block of stone. We've all seen these in Marat HaMachpelah, in Kever Rachel, in Meron at Kever Harashbi, right? The things that you're looking at are not graves, right? When you go to pray at Kever Harashbi, you have this big thing that's covered with a velvet mantle. That's not a grave. The grave is deep inside the ground. This is a tziyun kever. It's something that says this is the place where the people are buried. Okay, this is to show you, it's to tell the story, etc., etc. Okay, we also have, unfortunately, we're going to see this a lot in modern times. Something like what you see over here, right? We have a monument. This is we have a lot of andartot, a lot of monuments in the state of Israel for battles, but we also have something called a kever achim, a mass grave, a brother's grave, right? Brothers in arms, people who died together, were not separated into individual graves, and were buried together because of circumstances. We'll come back to this because we're gonna see it as we go on. Whoever asked if I'm talking about Tchiyat HaMetim, I will not be talking about Tchiyat HaMetim. That is not my department. Okay? Ask Rabbi Kalman to find you someone who's from and who can talk about that. Okay. Pilgrimage, right? Very, very interesting idea. Aliyah LaKever, right? If we're already talking about praying at graves, so the idea of going on a pilgrimage to graves makes sense, right? It's very connected. We want to go visit the graves. So you have this is a picture from Meron. Sorry, I just wanted to see one thing that I have here, so I don't forget it. Sorry. All right. It'll come back to me eventually. So this is a picture from Meron. We have this idea of pilgrimage to graves. We have yortzites, right? We have days that people commemorate the death of tzaddikim. Probably the most famous one is Lag BaOmer, right? Death of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. This idea of going on pilgrimage to the graves at specific times of year, okay? On the one hand, you could say, okay, Jews, especially Jews from Arab countries, pick this up from their Muslim neighbors. There's a Muslim custom called ziyara, where you go at certain times of year to the graves of holy people. But you could really take it further back and say, we have a very strong tradition of pilgrimage, of Aliyah LaRegel, pilgrimage to the Beit HaMikdash. When that became possible, right? Jews took on the idea, they kept the idea of pilgrimage, but instead they did pilgrimage to other places. And we definitely have a pilgrimage season, right? Times where it's easier to travel. And you'd have Jews who would come from all over, would come to Eretz Yisrael. Some of the Aliyot Larega kind of piggyback on the fame of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. If you're coming to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai for Lag BaOmer, so come to Rabbi Meir Baal HaNes in Tveria, who's very close by. Let's say that his day is second Pesach Sheni, Yud Daled Iyar, okay? Because it's right the same time. Let's come around that time. This is the season for pilgrimage to graves. So we're going to come back to Meron and to Tveria and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Okay, let's talk about a few famous graves. Okay, from the time of Tanakh. A very important famous graves, probably the most famous and the most authentic of all graves from the time of Tanakh, of course, is Ma'arat HaMachpelah in Hebron. Okay, why do we, anyone who knows me and who's listened to me on tours or on Zooms knows that I am very much a grave skeptic, okay? But there are very few people who are skeptical about Ma'arat HaMachpelah. Ma'arat HaMachpelah is the real deal, right? Why do we say this? For a number of reasons. First of all, the building, right? Look at this gorgeous building. This is a building from Herod. Now you can see it. It looks like the remnants of the walls around Har HaBayit. And this is a building from Herod, meaning it goes back 2,000 years. 2,000 years ago, there was already a very strong tradition that this is the place of Ma'arat HaMachpelah, of the Avot and the Imahot. Okay, that's one thing. Number two, okay, if you look at the picture over here, outside the building, can't do excavations inside the building, but outside the building, they discovered a bunch of these graves. They're called shaft graves, right? Graves where the body is put, we think of it as standing up, right? Instead of laying the body out horizontally, the bodies were put in vertically. This was done in the time of the Avot. This is how people buried in the time of the Avot. So we have these very ancient graves right outside the building of Ma'arat HaMachpelah. Okay, and the other thing that is very helpful to us is that we know that in the time of Abraham, the city of Hebron was on the top of the hill. Today, if you go to Hebron, you can go up the hill to Tel Rumeida. You can see the excavations that are there, and you can see there's actually now a national park called Tel Hebron. And you can see that the people lived at the top of the hill, and the burial was in the fields at the bottom of the hill, right? That's what Abraham buys from Ephron HaChiti. He buys part of his fields down at the bottom of the hill. Okay? After 1967, people were able to not excavate, but to kind of sneak in into underground passages underneath the area, the room of Yitzchak and Rivka, and we have evidence of ancient burial there. So really, Ma'arat HaMachpelah, the real deal. Okay, now we get to somebody who's a little bit more controversial. Okay, Kever Rachel. Okay, for those of us who have been to Kever Rachel in the last 20 years and have seen this, the picture here on the right, it's rather disturbing because you say, well, this looks like a military base. It looks like a fortress. And some of us still remember, maybe not this building, because this is a pretty old picture, but going into Beit Lechem and seeing the standalone Kever Rachel on the street in Beit Lechem. It does not look anything like that today. The structure is still there inside, but it's surrounded by this very monumental modern fortress building. Okay. It was renovated, by the way, in the 19th century already by Moses Montefiore, but today I wouldn't call it a renovation, I would just call it a change. When you go inside, you can still see some of what's left of the original building, and the sign, which was actually stolen and found and brought back, right? And you can go in and you can see this, but it's all inside a larger building. Kever Rachel, right? Mama Rachel, very connected to all of Am Yisrael, right? It's very much a place of tachanun, of tefillah, and people go there for all different kinds of occasions. But by the very nature of Rachel and her life story, it is a place for women who want to get married, and particularly for women who want to have children, because of Rachel and who she was. And the fact that she's buried on the road, right? we have the famous story of Rachel and Breshit, that she dies in childbirth and she's not brought to Hebron, and she's left on the side of the road. And for generations, starting already in the time of Yirmiyahu, Rachel v'Bakal Bana, and people would visit the grave, and today very much visited, particularly by women. One of the more recent things that was added in the wake of something that happened 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, right? The very, very horrible, one of the horrible murders of the Second Intifada was the murder of Nava Applebaum and her father, Dr. David Applebaum, on the night before her wedding. She was going to get married, and actually right now, Yud Gimel Elul, and she and her father went out to have a coffee the night before her wedding, and there was a suicide bomber. This was in Jerusalem, and Amy Rafaim, and they were both murdered. And he was also a very special person. And her mother, Deborah Applebaum, took her wedding dress and commissioned an absolutely stunning parochet in their memory, and it's actually hung in the women's section, right? It's meant to be a parochet for an aron kodesh, but the women it's supposed to be for the women, so it's in the women's section. Now, kever Rachel, right? Kever Rachel, is it kever Rachel? Is it not kever Rachel? We have some problem. We won't go into the whole story, but just to mention a little bit, right? We have a few problems with the story of where Rachel is buried, connecting it to where we now go to Kever Rachel, right? The most famous problem is what we mentioned before, Yirmiyahu, right? Yirmiyahu talks about Rachel, and he says, Kol birama nishma, right? Ramah is a place in Binyamin. Kever Rachel is in Beit Lechem in Yehuda. Okay? Add to that Rachel dies giving birth to Binyamin. Why would you want to bury her in Yehuda? We have other psukim that are also kind of create a problem. What's the story? Is this really the real Kever Rachel? I will say that certainly going back 2,000 years, going back to the time of the Tosefta, the belief is that Kever Rachel is in Beit Lechem. So that's pretty strong, right? That's a lot. To go back to the Tosefta, and then the Ramban comes to Eretz Yisrael, he talks about Kever Rachel, and there really is an unbroken chain of tradition that this is the real place. However, in the 20th century, there was a suggestion that this place called Kuber Bani Israel, it's north of Jerusalem, right? It's very close to a yeshuv called Adam on the way to Beit El. And right outside, right there are these huge stone monuments that are not houses, they're not foundations, they're just large monuments. 4, maybe 5, right? One of them is broken. And the Arabs call it Kuber Bani Israel, the Kvarim of Bnei Israel. When the Arabs say Bani Israel as opposed to Yahud, it means something old, right? It means something ancient. And already in the beginning of the 20th century, there were scholars who said, this is the real Kever Rachel. This is the real Kever Rachel, and the one in Beit Lechem, no, it's later, it's not the real thing. And there are opinions back and forth. I think the strongest opinion for the Kever Rachel in Beit Lechem is the fact that it was known for thousands of years and this was not known at all. But there are yesh vayesh, there are opinions in both directions. Okay, two more Tanakh people. Okay, this is called Nebi Samuel. It's a very beautiful site to the north of Yerushalayim. If you go to Ramot when you're in Yerushalayim, right, you keep on going a little past the Ramot Mall, you'll get to Nebi Samuel. It's one of the highest points in the area. It's almost 1,000 meters high. It's an amazing lookout towards Jerusalem and everything all around. And it was called Nebi Samuel, Kever Hanavi Shmuel, right? Meaning this is Ramah. This is a place where Shmuel is buried. Now, it becomes a very important place in Crusader times. Okay, the Crusaders built a massive fortress here. And in more recent times, in the 20th century, people said, no, it's not Ramah, it's not connected to Shmuel. There's nothing here because we don't have anything from Tanakh times. However, 20 years ago, more excavations were done. And that's what you see in the foreground of this picture here. And we found stuff that goes back to early Second Temple times. And in the foundations, in the fill of these buildings that go back to Hellenistic times, we find pottery that goes back to First Temple times. Okay, so this was a place in by Rishon times. Was it Ramah, as in the kever of Shmuel HaNavi? Today, most scholars say no. Most scholars say this is not Ramah. This is another place that's perhaps even more important than Ramah. It's a place called Mitzpah. And if you know your Sefer Shoftim and you know your Sefer Shmuel, Mitzpah, first of all, from the word tatzpit, a lookout, it's very high up, right? So that's a great name for it. It's a perfect lookout to everything all around. And in Mitzpah is the place where Am Yisrael gathers to pray before they go out to battle. It's the place where Shmuel gathers the people to do tshuva. It's the place where he gathers them to crown Shaul as the first king. So arguably a more important place than Kever Shmuel. There are still many people who think of it as Kever Shmuel who go to pray at the grave in kind of the basement of the building, which is a crypt from the Crusader Church. So yeah, not such a great place to pray, but it is an important site and a Tanakh site. Okay, one last Tanakh person, David HaMelech. Okay, King David's tomb on Har Zion. Is it David HaMelech? Is he really buried there? Is he buried somewhere else? Hey, on the one hand, we have a lot of tradition of this place going back at least 1,000 years. On the other hand, when you read Tanakh, and it talks about David HaMelech, it says that David is buried Be'ir David, and subsequent kings are buried Be'ir David. This is not Ir David. This is all the way up the hill. About 120 years ago, there was a French Jewish archaeologist whose name was Raymond Weil, and he excavated in Ir David, and he found something that he claimed was the real Kever David. It seems not. It seems it's a quarry. So far, we have not found anything that we could say with certainty is Kever David himself. But what we do think is that, what many people think, is that Kever David is the place where the later kings of Yehuda were buried. Because as Tanakh goes on, and we have kings after the time of Chizkiyahu, they're buried in a new place called Gan Uzzah. The city has expanded by then. Perhaps this is the grave of not David, but Malchei Beit David. Okay, we're going to leave aside Tanakh for a little bit, and we're going to do the first of our Who is Not Buried Here? Okay, so we have this fantastic grave site. It's called the Tomb of the Kings. It is north of the Old City. Right? It's right off of Derech Shechem. If you've never been there, that is not very surprising because it is actually owned today by the French government, who used to let people in. Now they're not so keen on letting people in. Why is it owned by the French government? It was excavated um, by the French, by a guy named Dissossi, and then it was bought by a French Jewish family in the 19th century who gave it to the French government, and they own it today. Okay, now what is this place? It's called the Tomb of the Kings. It's a very beautiful, very elaborate burial cave, which had in it, today you have to go to the Louvre to see it, this very gorgeous sarcophagus, okay? Not very fancy. I mean, it is very fancy, not very ornate, but very classy, which you might be able to see has a little inscription on it, okay? It's an inscription in Hebrew and also in a language called Palmyrian, a place called Palmyra or Tadmor in Hebrew. When this was first uncovered, the archaeologist Sossi said, "This is so fantastic. This is so beautiful. This must be what Josephus is talking about when he says there's a tomb of the kings of David and Solomon. This must be David and Solomon's tomb." When they excavated more and we knew more about burial practices, this is clearly a Second Temple period burial cave, just from the style. And also, the sarcophagus has writing in the Hebrew that we use in Second Temple times, okay? Not what we use in First Temple times, not the old Hebrew, not the Ketav Ivri. And it says on it, Sadan Malkita. right? Sadan, our mistress, the queen in Aramaic. What queen? Who is this? Right? So most people today say this is a very interesting woman who converts to Judaism and comes and lives out her days in Yerushalayim in the first century of the Common Era, and her name is Helene Hamalka, Queen Helene. Okay, she appears in the Mishnah, she appears in Josephus. Her sons convert to Judaism. She's a fascinating figure. And Josephus tells us that she's buried in Jerusalem, and this is her grave. So it's not an inauthentic grave, it's very authentic. It's just not the graves of David and Shlomo. Okay, let's take a look at a few important cemeteries. So we mentioned Har HaZeitim, okay? Har HaZeitim, like we said, very, very famous cemetery. Why Har HaZeitim? Because Jews don't bury inside a city. They begin to bury in the Kidron Valley. At a certain point, they bury on the western slope of the Kidron Valley, right outside of what today we call the Golden Gate, Shar HaRachamim. About 600 years ago, the Muslim conquerors, the Mamluks, come along. They say, we don't want you here. We want to have our own cemetery here. Today, if you go outside the Golden Gate, you'll see a Muslim cemetery. You guys move over to the eastern slope, and that's the Har HaZeitim of today. And that becomes the cemetery of Jerusalem. Very many famous people there. I picked out two for you. Okay. One, of course, is Rav Kook, who, of course, has a strong connection to Elul. Rav Kook, such a modest man, right? So important. But what does he choose to write on his grave? Just his name and his father's name and three aliyot, three times that he went up. Allah la'eretz HaKodesh. He came up to Eretz Yisrael, Kavchet B'Iyar, right? Interesting. What eventually becomes Yom Yerushalayim. Allah Yerushalayim. He went up to Jerusalem, Gimel Elul. Allah Hashamayma. He passed away. He went up to heaven, also Gimel Elul. So Gimel Elul, very much Elul connected to Rav Kook. And the ways of Reb Kook, and another famous grave up at the very top of the hill in what's called Chelkat Yerushalayim. Shai Agnon, Shmuel Yosef Agnon, a very significant writer, very important personality. Next to him is buried Henrietta Zold and Pinchas Rutenberg and other very important modern Jewish figures on Har HaZeitim. Okay? Probably second to Har HaZeitim in importance, right? If you could ask a Jew in Galut, right, in the last few hundred years, where do you want to be buried when you die? If you can be brought to Eretz Israel, right? Choice number one, Har HaZeitim. Choice number two, Hebron. Right, Hebron, because Kaver in Yishnei Hebron. That's an idea. We want to be buried with the people who sleep in Hebron, i.e., the Avot and the Imahot, right? Now we said when Avraham buys Ma'arat HaMachpelah or buys the land for Ma'arat HaMachpelah, it's at the bottom of the hill. Interesting, the thing that happens in Hebron, in the Middle Ages, things switch. And Jews buy land at the bottom of the hill to live in. And then at the top of the hill, near the Tell, land is cheap. They buy a big plot, and that's what they use as the cemetery. So from the Middle Ages, Jews are buried at the top of the hill in Hebron, not far from the Tell of Hebron. Very, very important cemetery with a lot of significant people. Here you have Rabbi Eliyahu Mani, you have the Chida, you have a lot of important people. One of the things that's, I don't know if it's unique, but it's definitely unusual in the Hebron Cemetery is that most of the monuments were without names, right? That was their custom, that they didn't put the name and the date. So how did you know who was who? The Chevra Kadishas kept very, very clear Pinkasim, right? They had notebooks that told us where people were buried, which is very good because in 1929, with the terrible riots in Hebron and with the subsequent Jews being, basically forced out of Hebron until 1967, the cemetery was terribly desecrated. After 1967, Jews were still not allowed back in Hebron. They were not allowed to bury in the Hebron cemetery. Burial starts there again with a terrible, tragic story in 1975. There's a couple named Baruch and Sarah Nachshon. He's a famous artist. And they are among the first families who live in Kiryat Arba. They have a child who they name Avraham, and he dies as an infant. And Sarah Nachshon decides that she is going to bury him in the ancient cemetery in Hebron. And she takes this child and she walks with him towards Hebron, where, of course, there are Israeli soldiers because Jews are not allowed to live in Hebron. That doesn't happen until 1979, 1980. And she goes to the soldiers, and the soldiers say, we're sorry, it's a terrible situation, but we can't let you in here. And she says, this is my baby. I'm going to bury him. And they have mercy on her and they let her through. And she buries him in the cemetery in Hebron. And she says, thousands of years ago, Avraham bought Hebron for Am Yisrael by burying his wife Sarah. Today, I, Sarah, reclaim Hebron for Am Yisrael by burying my son Avraham. Right, so it's really a crazy story. After that, another one of the residents of Kiryat Arba, somebody named Ben Sion Tavger, a Russian immigrant, takes on the job of restoring the cemetery, looking at these Pinkasim of the Chevra Kadisha and restoring the graves. And today you can go to the cemetery in Hebron and you can see the graves that are there, and they've been restored, and signs, and the graves of the victims from 1929 riots, and many more things. Okay, one more famous cemetery, Tzfat. All right, Tzfat definitely, I think, wins for most picturesque cemetery. Tzfat is a fascinating cemetery because, on the one hand, part of it is the very modern cemetery. Got a modern section which has the Ole Gardom. It has the people who were executed by the British in Akko. It has the children who were killed in the terror attack in Ma'alot in the 70s. But if you go to the older part, to the ancient part, you really have the whole story of Tzfat there in the cemetery. You can go up and walk around in the streets of Tzfat and go to the synagogues of the Ari and of Rabbi Yosef Karo and of the Alshich. And then you can go down the hill and actually go to their graves. And it's really an incredible thing. These are the authentic graves. It's close to where the original Yishuv was. Tzfat, of course, was plagued by earthquakes, and many of the houses were destroyed and rebuilt. But the original Yishuv was down at the bottom of the hill. And if you go to the Ari Sfaradi Shul, it's the only one that's at the bottom of the hill. It's the most authentic shul. And if you go into the cemetery, you can see clustered together, right, the Ari and Rav Moshe Cordovero and Rav Shlomo Alkabetz and the Mabit and really all of the greats. And of course, the blue, right? The blue is very much a spot color, right? The blue, like the blue of tzitzit, right? The blue that reminds you of the sea, that reminds you of the sky, that reminds you of God. And blue, of course, is the color of tzfat. Tzfat is not only famous for its cemetery, but the Ari himself was very, very connected to the ideas of graves, of knowing where graves are, of knowing who your neshama comes from, right? So the Ari believed in Gilgul Neshamot, in a form of reincarnation, that you are always, going to be a tikkun for somebody who came before you, came before you, came before you. And he would go around in the hills around Tzfat and identify graves and correct wrong graves, right? So we have this great sign. Rav Chaim Vital, who's of course one of the Ari's most famous students, right? He writes in his book, Shar HaGilgulim, that in Tzfat, in the cemetery, there is a place that is thought to be the grave of Hoshea ben Be'eri, the Navi. The Eino Kach, it's not him. It's the grave of Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya, the Tana, and people got all confused. But some people say, no, no, no. Really, it is Hoshea ben Be'eri. Al Kain Ra'oi L'chavein Al Shnehem. You should think about both those people when you go pray there, right? And that's really the Ari. He goes around and he identifies all sorts of graves like this one, Benaya ben Yehoyada. If you drive around in the north, especially in the areas, the little roads around Tzfat and the forests around Tzfat, you'll see signs all over the place for various biblical characters, Tanaim, Amoraim, many of them identified by the Ari. Okay, another one who is definitely not buried here. Okay, if you go into Tveria and you go to the southern part of the city, right, near Rabbi Meir Baal Hanes, you will see a big sign that says Kever Eshet Rachel Eshet Rabbi Akiva. This is not Kever Rachel Eshet Rabbi Akiva. Okay, it's a tradition from the 16th century. It's a Jewish tradition, but the Muslims have a tradition from 300 years earlier. There's somebody called Sit Sikinia, the daughter of Muhammad's nephew Hossein ben Ali. It's probably not either of those, but this was a tradition, and today there's a whole thing that's grown up around it, and people come, and there's all kinds of segulot and stuff that you can do. We're not even 100% sure where Rabbi Akiva's grave is, right? There are a few different suggestions about Rabbi Akiva's grave. It is extremely, extremely unlikely that someone like Rachel, the wife of Rabbi Akiva, would have had a kever that people would have known where it was. So sorry if I burst anybody's bubble, but it is not. Okay, there's a lot we want to do and not so much time, but let's see if we can get it done. Some famous rabbis' graves, okay? Two of them in Tveria. Tveria is the home of the Masorah, right? Tveria is the place where the Talmud Yerushalmi is completed. Tveria is the place where the Masoretes are, right? The guys who create the system of Ta'amim and of Nikud. It's where Torah Shebaal Peh really continues. And that's why you have so many important figures of Torah Shebaal Peh that are connected to Tveria. So one of them is the Tana, Rabbi Meir, or Rabbi Meir Baal HaNes. What's his nes, right? There are all kinds of midrashim about Rabbi Meir. Goes to Rome, and he has to free his sister-in-law from a brothel, and he bribes the guard, and the guard says, well, what's going to happen, when they catch me? And he says, just say, Aloka de Meir Anenu. Meir's God, answer me, right? And that's the nes of Rabbi Meir Baal HaNes. Rabbi Meir Baal HaNes is like the symbol of Tveria, certainly in 18th, 19th century when Tveria wanted to fundraise, right? And I'm sure there are people who have at home a Rabbi Meir Baal HaNes pushka, right? Because this was like the way that Tveria marketed itself. That you'll give to Rabbi Meir Baal HaNes and he'll help you. Okay? Later, about 1,000 years later, you have the Rambam. This is the Kever Rambam. The Rambam, who did not live in Tveria, right? Rabbi Meir Baal HaNes, Rabbi Meir the Tana, does live in Hamat, Tveria. Rambam, of course, lives and dies in Egypt, but he is buried in Eretz Israel. We already have a tradition from 1235. He dies in 1205. We already have a tradition from 30 years later that he's buried in Tveria. So that's a very old, very authentic tradition. Also, his father and his grandson are all buried in the same area. And this was the site of the old Jewish cemetery. Now, today the cemetery is south of Tveria, but this was the original Jewish cemetery. And this was definitely a grave that is very, very authentic. What is not so authentic or not so true to the spirit of the Rambam, who said, don't pray at graves, don't have anybody intercede for you, don't do any of this stuff. If you go to Kever Rambam, anyone who's been to Kever Rambam knows there are tons of people hawking things like holy Rambam water, or saying they're going to pray for you at the Rambam, and all kinds of things that the Rambam would not have liked. Okay, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is in Meron. It's a grave that was known already in the early 13th century. It was definitely very much a place of Aliyah LaRegel. Tragically now, we connect the story of Meron with the terrible disaster that happened on Lag BaOmer a few years ago, with the ramp collapsing and people being trampled. A horrible, horrible story. But Meron is a traditional place to visit. It is very old. And of course, the data goes on Lag BaOmer, but we have another tradition before 1948 of how people would go on Zayin Adar. Okay, Zayin Adar, which is the day that Moshe Rabbeinu passes away. We don't know Moshe Rabbeinu's grave. And so people would go on Zayin Adar to Meron. Why would they go to Meron? Because the Rashbi is supposed to be descended from Moshe Rabbeinu. And in this picture, this is a great picture. You have a picture of Jews and Druze dancing together. This is before 1948. The Druze venerate Yitro, Moshe's father-in-law. But before 1948, they didn't have access to what's called Nebi Shuaib, Yitro, what they believe is Yitro's grave. So they would also come to Meron. And the Jews and the Druze would come together and sing and teach each other various tunes, and their traditions kind of got mixed together in some ways. Okay, another grave that's very famous, especially for people who are on the grave circuit, is a place that is not far from Meron. It's in a forest near Tzfat, and it's called Amuka. And this is the kever of Yonatan ben Uziel. Yonatan ben Uziel, very important Tana, a student of Hillel, wrote the Targum, was considered to be a very, very holy person. And his grave has been known since the Middle Ages, but only in the last few decades has it become a place that you go to for shidduchim. Right? People go there. There's all kinds of things that people go. They go and they pray, but also people have been known to leave behind sidurim with their phone numbers in them, right? In the hope that, Rabbi Yonatan is going to be your shadchan. Why does this happen? There are various suggestions. Okay, one suggestion is that the Targum Yonatan in Sefer Dvarim on the pasuk Lo yachbo rechaim varechav, you shouldn't take the millstones of a poor person. Targum Yonatan says really what it means is don't separate between a chatan and a kala. Okay, maybe one suggestion. Another suggestion is that the name Amuka is was misunderstood, was confused with Rashi. It talks about a place that was Amuka Mikulam. It was the deepest place, and that's where you go for a shidduch. Want to go there for a shidduch? Go for it, but it's a very new tradition. Okay, I think we're going to skip who is definitely not buried here, Jesus. We're going to keep on going with a few more Jewish ones in the minutes that we have left. Okay, modern cemeteries. Okay, modern times, probably the most iconic cemetery is the Trumpeldor Cemetery in Tel Aviv, which today, this is a great aerial picture because you can see this packed cemetery. It's got over 5,000 graves. Today, surrounded by the modern buildings of Tel Aviv. When this cemetery was founded in the very, very beginning of the 20th century in 1902, Jews were living in Jaffa. They were living in Neve Tzedek, and they were burying in Jaffa. But there was a terrible cholera outbreak, and they really wanted to take these dead people who might have been carriers of the disease and move them far away from where people were living. So they bought land far away from Jaffa. Okay? Today it's the heart of Tel Aviv, but then it was far away. They built the cemetery, and if you're into cemeteries and you're into modern Israeli history, this is a fascinating cemetery because it's got all of the mi b'mi, all of the who's who of early Tel Aviv, of early Israel, right? You've got here Mayor Dizengoff, right? The legendary first mayor of Tel Aviv. You've got all the founders of Tel Aviv. You've got all different kinds of writers, Bialik and Achad Ha'am and Chernichovsky. And even today, right, if you are really, really connected and really, really important, like Arik Einstein, one of the greatest Israeli pop singers, you can still be buried there, even though there's very, very little room. Another very famous modern cemetery on the shores of the Kinneret, okay, right by what's called Kibbutz Kinneret. Okay, Kibbutz Kinneret was one of the early communities of the second Aliyah. Unfortunately, a lot of people were ill, got malaria, died young, or various other things, tuberculosis. One of those very famous people is Rachel, the poetess, Rachel HaMishoreret. And you have all sorts of very significant figures in early Zionism. And the other poetess or singer who's next to her, not far from her, is Naomi Shemer. Naomi Shemer
ירושלים של זהב.
dies quite a long time later, but she is also connected to the kibbutzim around there, and she is buried there as well.
ירושלים של זהב.
Okay. So just do a last few, okay? Okay, definitely not buried here, Kever Dan and Kever Shimshon, but I want to go on to memorials. Okay, and like we said at the beginning, unfortunately, Israel is very good at war memorials. We have many of them. I don't know if it's the first one, but definitely one of the first ones, and definitely one of the most famous ones is the Roaring Lion at Tel Chai. Okay, and this is in memory of the 8 who fell in Tel Chai, Yud Aleph Adar 1920. Okay, the battle where they were attacked. This is, of course, Yosef Trumpeldor died here. This is what Kiryat Shmona is named after, these 8. Okay, and this statue of the roaring lion, it was very iconic, and it kind of led the way for other war memorials. It's right in front of the cemetery of the Shomer, of the first Jewish self-defense organization. This is all the way up north of Kiryat Shmona. We also have the Palmach Cemetery, cemetery in Kiryat Anavim, right outside of Jerusalem. Right, and this is where, before there was a Har Herzl, right? Kiryat Anavim was where the Palmach had the elite forces had their own cemetery, and it's a place where you go and you just see so many young people who were cut down, who were so significant to winning those battles of the War of Independence.
Could you tell us,
And
please,
maybe
Shulie,
what's how the Lamed Hey, that's a very long story, but maybe one last story here. And that's the story of the Old City in 1948. And in 1948, the Jews in the Jewish quarter battled from the end of November 1947 until their surrender 6 months later, May 28th, 1948, 6 straight months of battle. In the last couple of months, people who were killed in the Old City could not be taken out for burial. There was a siege, and so they were buried inside the Jewish quarter, even though this is against halacha, but there was no choice. And they were not removed after 1948, and only in 1967 were the bodies taken out and buried in a mass grave on Har HaZeitim. So the picture here on the right is the mass grave today with the fighters of the Jewish quarter, and we say fighters using that term very loosely. Nisim Gini, 10 years old. Rabbi Yitzchak Orenstein, the rabbi of the Old City. So after 1967, the bodies were taken out of the Old City, but the street where they were buried was called Gal Ed, a monument. And recently there was this really very special monument to those fighters that was put up on that street. So they're not buried there, of course, anymore, but it was meant to be a memorial to them. Okay, I think that's all we will do right now. I see we have a few different questions in the chat. Maybe I'll finish a few next time. And then we will do other stuff next week for Rosh Hashanah.
Could you tell us? Could you tell us whether the
I can't hear this question. 1 second. I'm just going to look at the questions in the chat for a minute, and then I'll hear other questions. Was the custom of leaving the body to decompose and collecting and saving the bones unique to Judaism? Or no, a lot of cultures did primary and secondary burial. Okay. Most of those buried on Har HaZeitim are now in Kever Achim. Yeah, I don't think it's Kevrachim. What happened after 48, of course, is that the Jordanians desecrated much of Har HaZeitim, not all of it, but much of it. And after 67, and it's continuing till today, okay, the monuments are being recreated. And again, it's based on these pinkasim. It's based on these notations of the Chevra Kadisha. So I don't think it's 100%, but I think a lot of the graves are okay. Sneaking into the areas at Marat HaMachpelah, well, I wouldn't suggest that you do it, but people did it because they really wanted to understand what was there. Is it a desecration? I don't know if it's a desecration because they didn't actually get to the graves. They just went underneath the Tziyun Kever.
It says that when
all these places
they talk about being in a cave. I mean, I read what it says
they
in
go under the cave, yes, but they don't get to
it down and
actual
walked
grave.
and she found a cave. I mean, that's like not right. I thought I didn't seem right to me.
Okay, it was done. Whether it was right or not, we can argue, but it was done. Okay, all these places can a Kohen visit? Yeah, that's also controversial, right?
Yeah,
There's a
right.
question of Kohanim, Kivrei Tzadikim. Can you go to Kever Tzadik? Is it not Mikabel Tum'ah? Different people have different opinions.
Shulie, I wanted to ask you, is the name Trumpeldor alluded to in the name of Beitar?
Beit
Beitar, the movement.
Beitar. Yeah, Brie Trumpeldor. Yes, of course. Brie Trumpeldor. Okay, the Trumpeldor Cemetery, by the way, doesn't have anything to do with Trumpeldor. Okay, it's on Trumpeldor Street. That's why it's called the Trumpeldor Cemetery. Okay, I think we are done unless people have other comments
can I
or
just ask you a
questions. Yes,
question?
I'm listening.
The Ophel outside of Yerushalayim is considered to have certain burials as well. People who went up to the Beit HaMikdash would purify themselves before going in at the Ophel. So that's excavated now. Biblical Archaeology Review has on the cover of this month's issue the Ophel excavations, just so you should know.
There's a lot of excavations, but I don't know of any graves there.
Well, they say that there were graves that were found there. So I didn't go into the excavation details, but there were graves that were found there, but they don't know of who. They don't have a clue.
All right, interesting. I did not know that. I will have to go and take a look. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, anybody else have anything they want to add? All right, maybe we'll do a little of this next time. We'll see, and we'll also do some Rosh Hashanah stuff. Okay, thank you, everyone. Shabbat shalom.
Shalom.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Shabbat shalom.
תודה רבה, שבת שלום.
Thank you.
Always fascinating. Thank you.
Shabbat shalom.